Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share tales that touch the heart and remind us of the extraordinary power of compassion and connection. Today, we bring you a story of redemption and second chances, a retired police officer and the young boy he saved, whose reunion years later transforms both their lives forever. It was a cold December evening in Atlanta, Georgia. The streets were eerily quiet, with the occasional whistle of the wind and the faint sound of holiday music floating from a distant store. Officer Jack Monroe, a seasoned policeman with a calm demeanor and sharp instincts, drove his patrol car through the frosty streets. The red and blue lights of his vehicle flickered against the icy windows of parked cars, a stark contrast to the warmth of Christmas decorations dotting the neighborhood. Jack had spent many nights responding to emergency calls, but he could never have imagined the event of this night would haunt him for decades. The 911 call came in about an armed robbery at a small convenience store called Frank's Mart, a modest shop nestled in the heart of a working-class neighborhood. As Jack arrived, his sharp eyes quickly assessed the scene. Through the fogged-up windows, he could see three figures, one behind the counter, another brandishing a weapon, and a third, a woman, lying on the floor. It was the sound of muffled sobs that pierced through the tension, making Jack's heart clench. Somewhere inside, a child was crying. His training took over as he stepped out of the car, gun in hand, and approached the store. The automatic doors opened with a faint whoosh, letting out a wave of warm, stale air mixed with fear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. The scene before him was gut-wrenching. A young boy, no older than 11, knelt by a woman who lay in a pool of blood. His small hands pressed desperately against her wound as tears streamed down his face. "Please, my mom needs help," the boy cried, his voice cracking with desperation. The robber, a man with wild, darting eyes, swung his gun erratically between the cashier, the boy, and now Jack. "Don't come any closer," he screamed, his voice trembling as much as his hands. The tension in the air was palpable, each second stretching endlessly as Jack weighed his options. Jack's voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Nobody else needs to get hurt tonight. Let the boy go. We can work this out." He took a careful step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's shaking hand. But the robber was cornered, like a wounded animal lashing out in fear. His gun shifted toward the boy, and in a split second, Jack's instincts took over. Two deafening gunshots rang out, and the man crumpled to the floor. Jack immediately rushed to the woman's side, pulling off his jacket to press against her wound. "What's your name?" he asked the boy, trying to keep him focused. "Michael," the boy stammered through tears. "Michael Carter. Please help my mom." The woman's eyes fluttered open for a moment, her voice a faint whisper. "Rachel," she said, her gaze fixed on her son. "Take care of him." The sirens grew louder in the background, but Jack knew they wouldn't be fast enough. Rachel's breathing grew shallow, and the light in her eyes began to fade. "Stay with us, Rachel. Help is coming," Jack urged, his voice breaking. Michael clung to his mother's hand, his small frame trembling with sobs. "Mom, don't leave me. Please, don't go." Rachel managed a weak smile, her lips forming the words, "My brave boy." And then, she was gone. The store fell silent, save for the boy's anguished cries. When the paramedics arrived, Jack gently pulled Michael into his arms, shielding him from the sight of his mother's lifeless body. The weight of the tragedy settled heavily on Jack's chest as he handed Michael his badge number. "If you ever need anything, call me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, as Jack drove home, the image of Michael's tear-streaked face and Rachel's final moments played on a loop in his mind. It was a memory that would stay with him, shaping the choices he made for years to come. But for now, all he could do was grip the steering wheel tighter and stare into the darkness, wondering if he had done enough. 22 years had passed since that fateful night at Frank's Mart. Officer Jack Monroe had long since retired, trading the red and blue lights of a patrol car for the quiet solitude of his modest home on the outskirts of Atlanta. His once dark hair was now streaked with silver, and the lines on his face told the story of a man who had seen too much. His home was tidy but empty, reflecting a life spent more on duty than on personal fulfillment. The badge he once wore proudly now rested in a drawer, a relic of a time that felt like a different lifetime. The December wind whistled outside as Jack sat in his favorite armchair, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and flipping absent-mindedly through an old photo album. The faces of his younger self and his late wife, Diane, stared back at him, reminders of a family he'd loved but failed to prioritize during his years on the force. A knock at the door startled him, breaking the quiet rhythm of his evening. Jack wasn't expecting anyone. His social life had withered over the years, leaving him with few visitors. He opened the door cautiously, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the man standing on his porch, dressed in a tailored suit. The man exuded quiet confidence, his warm brown eyes holding a depth of emotion that seemed to mirror Jack's own. There was something familiar about him, though Jack couldn't immediately place it. "Officer Monroe?" the man asked, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Retired," Jack corrected, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Can I help you?" The man's face broke into a smile, one that was both genuine and tinged with nostalgia. "I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my life 22 years ago. My name is Michael Carter." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The name hit him like a thunderclap, pulling him back to that night in the convenience store. The sobbing boy kneeling beside his mother, the weight of his small frame in Jack's arms as he tried to offer some form of comfort. And now, here he was, all grown up, a man who had clearly found success despite the tragedy that had marked his childhood. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper. "I kept this," he said, holding up the badge number Jack had given him that night. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the numbers were still legible. "It's been with me through everything. It reminded me that someone cared, even when I felt like the world didn't." Jack felt a lump form in his throat as he stared at the piece of paper. A simple gesture he'd almost forgotten, but one that had clearly meant everything to this man. "Michael," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I always wondered what happened to you." Michael smiled, a mixture of pride and gratitude shining in his eyes. "I went through the foster system for a while. It wasn't easy, but I was lucky to end up with a family who believed in me. I worked hard, went to college, and eventually law school. Now, I work as a public defender. I wanted to help people the way you helped me." Jack's chest tightened, a swell of pride and disbelief washing over him. "You've done well for yourself, Michael. Your mother would be so proud." Michael's smile faltered for a moment, and he looked down at the badge number in his hand. "I think about her every day. I've spent my life trying to honor her memory. But there was always a part of me that felt like I needed to thank you. You didn't just save my life that night, you gave me a chance to live it." Jack felt his knees weaken, and he gestured for Michael to come inside. As they sat together in the living room, Michael shared his journey, his struggles, his triumphs, and the moments when he clung to Jack's simple act of kindness like a lifeline. In turn, Jack opened up about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save Rachel. About how that night had changed the way he saw his role as a police officer and as a human being. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that both men had been carrying their own burdens, shaped by the events of that fateful night. But in this unexpected reunion, there was a chance for redemption, not just for Jack, but for Michael, too. Together, they began to bridge the gap between past and present, finding solace in the shared understanding that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out in ways they'd never imagined. Before Michael left that evening, he turned to Jack with a determined expression. "I'm hosting a dinner tomorrow at my home. I'd like you to meet my family. You've been a part of my life in ways you might not even realize. And it's time they meet the man who made it possible." Jack hesitated, unused to such invitations. But the earnestness in Michael's voice made it impossible to refuse. "I'd be honored," he said softly. As Michael drove away, Jack stood at the door, staring into the night with a heart that felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to reconcile with the past and embrace the possibility of a brighter future. The next evening, Jack arrived at Michael's home just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He hesitated on the doorstep, his hand hovering over the doorbell. The house before him was warm and inviting, its soft glow spilling out onto the neatly trimmed lawn. The sound of laughter echoed faintly from within, a stark contrast to the solitude Jack had grown accustomed to. Gathering his courage, he pressed the button, and moments later, the door swung open. Michael greeted him with a wide smile, his tailored suit exchanged for a more relaxed sweater and jeans. "You made it," he said warmly, stepping aside to let Jack in. The interior of the house was just as inviting as its exterior. Family photos adorned the walls, capturing moments of joy and togetherness. The aroma of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of soft jazz playing in the background. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd been in a home so full of life. "Come on in," Michael said, guiding him toward the living room. "There's someone I want you to meet." Jack followed, his steps tentative. In the living room, a woman with a kind smile and an air of quiet strength stood to greet him. Her auburn hair was swept into a loose bun, and her apron bore a few flour smudges. "This is my wife, Sophia," Michael said, his pride evident. "Sophia, this is Jack Monroe, the man I've told you so much about." Sophia extended her hand, her grip firm but warm. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Monroe. Michael has spoken about you for years." Jack felt a flush of embarrassment but managed a modest smile. "Please, call me Jack. And the honor's mine. You've built a beautiful home." Sophia beamed, her gaze briefly flickering to Michael before returning to Jack. "Thank you. Dinner's almost ready. Why don't you two catch up while I finish setting the table?" As Jack and Michael settled into the living room, their conversation drifted from memories of the past to the lives they now led. Jack learned about Michael's work as a public defender, his dedication to giving a voice to those who often went unheard. Michael spoke passionately about his cases, his love for his family, and the balance he tried to maintain between the two. "I tried to be the father my mom would have wanted me to be," Michael admitted, his voice softening. "I want my daughter to know she's my priority, no matter what." As if on cue, a little girl with bouncy curls and Michael's warm brown eyes darted into the room, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She stopped short when she saw Jack, her curiosity evident. "Daddy, is this the police officer you told me about?" Michael chuckled and nodded. "Yes. Lily, this is Mr. Monroe." Lily's eyes widened in wonder as she approached Jack. "Are you a real hero?" she asked earnestly. Jack felt a lump in his throat. "I'm not sure about that." "Sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle. "I just did my job." Lily looked unconvinced. "Daddy says you saved his life." "That sounds like a hero to me." Michael placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. His gaze steady. "She's not wrong. You know." Dinner was a lively affair, filled with laughter and stories. Jack found himself loosening up, sharing anecdotes from his days on the force and even laughing at Michael's attempts to recount childhood memories from a perspective only a child could have. The warmth of the family enveloped him, filling a void he hadn't realized was so deep. As the evening wore on, Michael's tone grew more serious. "Jackie," he said, leaning forward, "I've been thinking about something. You've been such an important part of my life, even when you didn't realize it. I think it's time we pay it forward." Jack tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "There's a boy at the community center where I volunteer," Michael explained. "His name is Marcus. He's been through a lot, lost his father, and his mom is struggling to make ends meet. He reminds me of myself at his age. I think he could use someone like you in his corner." Jack felt a mix of emotions, uncertainty, hesitation, but also a spark of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "I don't know. Michael, what if I let him down?" Michael shook his head. "You won't. Just like you didn't let me down. Sometimes all it takes is one person showing they care." Jack nodded slowly, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll meet him." The next morning, Jack found himself standing outside the community center, his breath visible in the crisp winter air. Inside, he met Marcus, a wiry 12-year-old with sharp eyes and a guarded demeanor. Their first conversation was tentative, each testing the waters. But by the end of the hour, Marcus was smiling, a small but significant victory. As Jack drove home that evening, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Michael's family had reminded him of the power of connection, and Marcus had shown him that it was never too late to make a difference. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was truly living not just for himself, but for others. The road to healing was far from over. But as Jack pulled into his driveway and stepped into his quiet home, he knew he was no longer walking it alone. Thank you for watching this heartfelt journey on Empathy Stories. We hope Jack and Michael's tale of forgiveness, love, and rebuilding touched your soul and inspired you to find the beauty in second chances. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. See you next time.